The Christian Directory lays out all the fundamental duties of the work ethic, which are number one, you have to work really hard. You have to be frugal, asceticism. You're not allowed to indulge in idle pleasures. You're not allowed to waste anything. You put all that together and you have the very model of the profit maximizing business person who's working like crazy. And we should be working pretty much all the time. But there's something uplifting about it because they're saying the lowest street sweeper is obeying God's commands in service to humanity and should be respected as much as anyone who's doing some fancy job, like they're an ambassador or something.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. This is the first episode of a multi-part series. It's the first series we've produced here at Work for Humans, but it turned out to be a big topic and we didn't want to skimp. I first came across the work of Elizabeth Anderson while I was trying to comprehend coerced prison labor in the United States, but I discovered a much bigger story that goes back 600 years and that influences attitudes toward management in corporations every day. Elizabeth Anderson is one of today's leading political philosophers, and she has spent years studying how the work ethic shapes our economy, society, and politics. In her latest book, Hijacked, she explores how hard work, a principle originally intended to advance the virtue of helping others, has been used by parts of society in ways that harm workers. This is the first of a three-part conversation tracing the history of the work ethic from its religious roots with Martin Luther and the Reformation to its influence on modern policies like prison labor reform in California. In this episode, we dig into the early history, how the Protestant Reformation shaped the ideas about labor, how work became a moral obligation, and how these century-old ideas still shape our world today. All right. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoy this episode so you don't miss the next one. And now, my conversation with Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth Anderson, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about your book, Hijacked. The subtitle is really important, how neoliberalism turned the work ethic against workers and how workers can take it back. The book itself is 350 pages, and it's 16 hours of listening on Audible. And I can't tell you, I've listened to it twice now because there's so much information in it, and it's so detailed and so rich in terms of the historical roots of the work ethic and tracing it through history of political thought that we just need to spend some time. So I want to start at the beginning of the work ethic. And in your book, you start with Luther and then go on to explain how the work ethic is to some extent a reaction to Luther. So what was the beginning there with Luther and how did that lay the groundwork?
So we have to start with Reformation theology. The previous Catholic ideology was, in certain ways, you could earn your salvation. You could pray. You could even pay indulgences to get you or your relatives or loved ones off from days in purgatory. Right? There are all kinds of ways to wheedle your way into God's favor and gain salvation. Luther, of course, revolted against all that. He saw it as the height of corruption, that the church is essentially selling access to heaven. And he came up with the idea that salvation was by faith alone. And faith is a pure gift of God. Now, you might think this is terrifying because God does not award salvation on the basis of anything we deserve. On the Protestant view, in fact, we're absolutely abhorrent beings. None of us are entitled or have earned or deserved salvation because of original sin. We're all sinners. And so we just have to lean on God's favor. But we can know that we're saved if we have faith. Faith that Jesus is our Savior, right? And just out of his graces, he will save us. as long as we have faith. Now, on one hand, right, it was liberating for Luther to think this because the Catholic doctrine of sin just took for granted that the expression or manifestation of any appetite in human beings, notably lust, was a sin. Even lusting after your heart for another person was a sin and could condemn you to hell forever. But of course, these are involuntary reactions. We all deserve to be damned on that account, and that's terrifying. So the idea that we could actually get salvation completely unmerited just by the grace of God was a profoundly liberating idea and good news for human beings who would otherwise be damned. So Luther spread this doctrine. It was wildly popular. The Reformation is sweeping across Europe. But Luther himself encountered difficulties in his own congregation, which was, well, if sin doesn't really send me to hell, then why bother being good? And so we see in his sermons that he's railing against people who don't even want to attend church anymore because that's not necessary. They are swearing, drinking, refusing to give to charity, really just disdainful of the moral law. Luther was very upset about that, but he didn't really have a great solution.
There's a couple of themes that start here already that I think we're going to track throughout. One of them is, for the first large chunk of all of the thinkers that we're going to talk about, they base their reasoning on, what would God do? What would God want? He's in that line, and it's going to go for a while, until the 1700s when people started saying, no, we need to look for something besides God to justify political thought, economic thought. So that's one thing. And the second thing is, there's always going to be this thread, and it's fairly muted, I think, that sex and vice go together. And we're going to see it later on, and I kept humming to myself the Oingo Boingo song, Wild Sex in the Working Class, because there's this idea throughout all of this that certain people are vice-ridden, and that vice and idleness go together, but that vice and sex go together. And I think this makes total sense. It's a tough place you put everybody in a way, which is you have to have faith to go to heaven. You have no choice about whether or not you have faith. Acts during life have no bearing on salvation.
Yep, that's exactly right. It's a terrifying doctrine.
Yeah. So what was the remedy? What happened that people started saying there needs to be another way?
So this is where Calvinism comes in. Calvin looked at Luther's doctrine, and he thought that it would lead to a lot of licentiousness, right? Because, hey, I could do anything and I won't be damned for doing it, just as long as I know in my heart that I have faith. Now, Calvin didn't reject the view that our salvation has nothing to do with our conduct, but he had a very clever way of avoiding licentiousness for people who believed in that doctrine. And that was to make it a matter of profound uncertainty whether we really do have faith. So Calvin and the Puritans in England, who were basically Calvinists, it's important to understand that the Church of England adopted a Calvinist theology as its core doctrines of salvation. Calvin's solution to this problem was to become behaviorists about our self-knowledge. So behaviorists think that introspection is useless. You can't look into your heart or into your head to really know what you really believe. You can only tell what you really believe by looking at your external behavior. Why? Because we're so desperate to believe that we're saved that we can fool ourselves into thinking that we really have faith. But that's just self-deception. The only way to really know that we have faith is that we're actually obeying God's law in our conduct. So we look to our external behavior to see whether we have faith. In addition, Calvin said, the fundamental duty that we have is to serve our fellow human beings through disciplined labor. And that's the core of the work ethic right there. And that's picked up by the Puritans in England.
On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. Baked into that idea, it seems to me, is that God wants us to serve our fellow human beings, and that evidence that we are doing God's work in that way is evidence of salvation.
Evidence that we have faith, right? And that's evidence of salvation. That's correct. So the idea is you could get people to work hard. It's the only way they could gain assurance that they're saved.
Now, Baxter is one of the first thinkers that you really dive into as a great example of Puritan thought. One of the things I learned studying this is that Puritan thought is not one thing. And so you pick any example, and it's not going to be, there's arguments still about whether or not he was a Puritan or something that I did not know even existed, which is an Arminian. But he's an example of how this was formulated. And I found him rather compelling. Like along the way, as I was reading these different thinkers, there were some of them I was like, I kind of get that. So what was Baxter's perspective?
Baxter really is the leading figure who developed the work ethic in its fullest vision. And he wrote a 5-volume Christian directory, which was his comprehensive guide to how to live well as a good Christian, comprehensive guide to Christian ethics. It's beautifully written, by the way. Baxter himself was unbelievably prolific. Over the course of his life, he wrote 500 books. Now, it's actually, when you think about it, it's not that hard, given that you have to give a sermon every Sunday that goes on for hours and hours. No, you do have to be very, very good about writing, but he was a very disciplined writer. At any rate, the Christian directory lays out all the fundamental duties of the work ethic, which are: number one, you have to work really hard. You have to be industrious, very disciplined work. Number two, you have to be frugal. That is, you have to save. You can't just spend things on luxuries. So number three, asceticism. You're not allowed to indulge in idle pleasures or luxuries of any kind. 5, you're not allowed to waste anything. He has a whole chapter about how sinful it is to waste time. Everything must be used. You have to put all of Earth's natural resources to good use. You're not allowed to waste any material resources. You're not allowed to waste time. And finally, if you are an earner, you should try to make as much money as you can. And that also can't be wasted. So spending on luxuries is waste. Okay, and you put all that together, right, and you have the very model of the profit maximizing business person who's working like crazy to do a good job at their work. It's important that work, the only thing that counts as real work, is something that is of service to other people. It has to be useful to them, not just to yourself. So any kind of scammy business model is strictly excluded on Baxter's theology. Everything has to be adding value.
How was this tied to what God wanted?
God gave the earth to human beings to use to help each other survive and flourish. But of course, only through diligent work can we enable that to happen. And we should be working pretty much all the time. So the result is it's a very instrumentalized attitude to practically everything. You're always asking, well, what good is it? Right? It has to be useful for something further. Our own activity is very instrumentalized. Natural resources are instrumentalized. There's very, very little time for relaxation, for pleasure, for play, or fun, or imagination. Puritans didn't have much patience for these things because they're always asking, well, you should be using your time for something useful. Don't waste your time in idleness. Everything is idleness if it's not work. The one exception, of course, is on Sundays, God decreed that we have a day of rest. But the Puritans interpreted that to mean, well, of course, because where our bodies get exhausted. And so we do need a day of rest, but that's only justified because it helps us recharge to go get back to work.
And what does instrumentalized mean? It means put to use?
Yes.
Like everything must be put to use.
Correct. What that means is there's very little appreciation for the intrinsic value of lived experience. The pleasures of the moment, like just playing or spending time with friends, talking or playing games. Puritans notoriously were very skeptical of such activity. Or say just creation, just creating art or enjoying novels. No, that's all waste.
They don't sound like much fun.
Oh, they're definitely not fun. No, they were definitely the killjoys of the 16th and 17th centuries.
And yet, widely embraced.
Yeah. But there's something uplifting about it. That's what's so funny about it, is that they're sending a message that's very powerful because what they're saying is ordinary people, not just priests and highfalutin characters, ordinary people are doing God's work. And consequently, it's meaningful, it's uplifting. They're saying the lowest street sweeper is obeying God's commands in service to humanity and should be respected as much as anyone who's doing some fancy job, like they're an ambassador or something. The equality of callings, the equality of occupations from God's point of view is a very strong theme in these Puritans. And so you could see how this could be popular. Ordinary people going to church, they're exalted as much as the richest person in town. And in fact, they might even be more exalted if the richest person in town is, say, an idle aristocrat who's simply collecting rents but doing no good for other people.
Okay, so there's three things here that I think we're going to keep following as threads. One is, who are people? People are sinners. So that's the frame. Who is God? Well, God is somebody who wants good for his creation and wants good for the people. And work is, well, put it this way. Work is virtue. Idleness is vice. And was it already expressed at this point, the idea that it doesn't matter who's idle? The idle rich are as vice-ridden as the idle poor.
Absolutely, yes.
Already framed?
Yes, so this is a strictly class-neutral ethic. Everybody has to work. In one of the volumes of the Christian Directory, Baxter imagines he's kind of like an advice columnist receiving inquiries from people. And indeed, these might have been real inquiries that people asked. And he imagines a rich person, he depicts a rich person asking, well, suppose I'm so rich I could just hire other people to do my work for me. It's a little bit like a rich person who might pay a poor person to take their place in the army. Will I have fulfilled my duty to work by basically paying somebody else to do it for me? And Baxter says, read the Bible in Genesis. When Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, God tells Adam, you must work by the sweat of your brow to the end of your days. And he commanded that to absolutely everyone without exception. So yeah, those idle aristocrats who are just fox hunting and putting on fancy balls and dressing up, no, that is not okay. You have to be doing something that's useful and helpful for other people.
Now, there's something going on historically at this time, and we're actually going to go through several really large phases of the sort of the structure of work. And I think we should probably talk about them now because the context in which Baxter was speaking was one of the first phases. And so there was the phase that was largely agrarian. The lords owned the land. The commoners lived on the land. And then over time, and we're going to talk about each of these things because they're super important. And part of the reason they're important is that the different phases of the structure of the economy are often used to inform decisions in a later generation in which the context has really changed. And so this was a time when lords owned the land. And by the way, we are anchoring largely on England throughout all of this conversation. And I'm sure that there's a conversation to be had through other parts of the world. So what was the state? And I'll just say what some of the big changes are going to be just so that we have those laid out. There's the process of enclosure where the commoners were essentially pushed off of commonly shared land. Then there's industrialization that happens later and whatever we have today. But what is sort of the pre-enclosure state of the economy?
I should say that there were some enclosures that were happening in the 17th century, but they weren't so bad as later enclosures.
Right. They started in the 1400s, and enclosure kept happening through the 1800s and eventually became parliamentary efforts to enclose land. So yes, some enclosures had happened.
Yeah. So there had been some enclosures already. And in response to that, Parliament had actually passed some laws that made it much more difficult to enclose land in the 17th century.
And can you say what it was pre-enclosure? How did things work?
In the 17th century, actually, is peak yeoman farmer. So this is the era when yeoman farmers had it best. And it was a result of 16th century laws that put yeomen in a very, very favorable position. So these are peasant farmers. Some of them own their own land, but most of them don't. Most of them are leasing their land from the landowners. But what Parliament had done is establish a norm of leases for 3 lives. Okay, that is that you would sign a lease with your landlord that would cover your entire life, your son's entire life, and your grandson's entire life. By convention, this was set at 99 years. And believe it or not, even today, there are still some residual leases that are for 99 years. Imagine that. Now, what's extraordinary about this is that the lease would have the same rent for 99 years. If there was any inflation, your grandson would just be like paying almost nothing, right? Now, the thing about having a 99-year lease is that it's almost as good as straight out owning the land. And consequently, you can afford to invest in that land. You can put up fences, dig irrigation ditches. It'll pay for you to do that because you'll reap the benefits for 99 years.
And I'm on the Lord's land, but I have this lease. Do I owe the Lord a percentage of what I produce? But that's essentially the tax.
You owe an annual rent. It's not sharecropping. It would be a fixed dollar amount. You might pay it in your crop if there's not enough cash around, but that would depend on the market value of the crop for that year.
And because I live on the commons, if I'm a yeoman, I'm a commoner. That's where the word comes from, right?
Commons are a little bit different. So
okay.
The lease would be for a specific plot of land, which would be your farm. And then the commons would be, say, where you would put a cow or something to graze.
I see.
And the commons would be commonly managed by the peasants. They would decide how many cows could be put out there, or other animals perhaps, to make sure that it wasn't overgrazed.
It's interesting because we still say yeoman-like labor.
Yeah.
That's the adjective we use to say hard labor.
Yeah. Oh, it's very hard work. Yes. Farming is hard, even today.
But there was already this idea that's going to flow throughout all of this that you shouldn't have control over more land than you can make productive. Was this already in the air?
Right? You're not allowed to waste anything. Right? You can't waste natural resources. This is a big theme of Locke's. He doesn't like these aristocrats who have magnificent lawns, which is not producing anything useful, say crops or anything, but just for the stateliness or the aesthetics of having a vast spread of grass or something. No, not okay. That should be put to use.
Let's start moving on to Locke, because we're going to spend some time on Locke. I want to start by saying, where does Locke sit in the pantheon of these thinkers? And the reason I say that is that there's lots of people talking, including Baxter and others, about what should happen, but Locke seems to really stand out as a major thinker. And one of my questions as we talk about these thinkers is, how should we consider them? Baxter, for instance, we can take as the originator of a lot of ideas. He was so prolific, and he taught a lot of people to behave a certain way. But we can also see him as sort of a representative of his time, which is maybe he's not the source of these ideas. Maybe he's essentially just the most articulate speaker of these ideas. And so when we get to Locke, what is Locke? How do we think about him? Is he the originator of big ideas? Is he voicing the zeitgeist?
Yeah, well, Locke is a very pivotal figure, and he continues to have influence today. That's why I spend so much time on Locke in Hijacked. What makes him influential today, I think, is a profound misreading of Locke. So Locke, in his second treatise of government, chapter 5, offers an account of the justification of private property. And that justification has been picked up by libertarians today, neoliberals, to suggest that the government isn't allowed to regulate your property or even to tax it or redistribute it in any way. You can see how that would be very appealing to very wealthy people who resent any kind of taxation or regulation of their property. But what I argue is that reading of Locke, even though it's profoundly influential today in justifying unlimited wealth and the removal of any constraints or regulations or taxation on rich people, is a complete misreading of Locke. That Locke is not a libertarian. He, in fact, is an advocate of the work ethic and justifies private property in work ethic terms.
So this was one of my questions. I think we're going to go through this, each of the points for the justification of libertarianism and each of the points as you interpret them. We're really going to dive into Locke. Before we do that, first of all, you just open another box, which is the idea of what justifies ownership and of things. Before we go on to Locke, did Baxter have an opinion of what justifies the ownership?
You know, Baxter, he's not really a political theorist. He's a Christian moralist. And
he's a moralist,
takes
yeah.
for granted the laws of the realm.
And so that's one of the things that really makes Locke stand out, is that Locke starts to ask questions about the operating system.
Correct.
It's not just a moral. And in fact, did Locke have a tendency to use God as justification, or was he using some other approach?
Locke is still very much a work ethic guy, so God is there. God lays down the fundamental principle of morality, which is to protect and promote human life. That's what our duty on earth is. And that's consistent with the work ethic.
Okay. And then I had the question as I was reading this, which is, I know why we argue about the real author's intent. About the Bible, for instance. So people are saying, well, what's God's intent in this authorship? And we're going to try to interpret that, and we're going to try to make decisions based upon it. And then I can see it in, like, for instance, the U.S. Constitution, which is, you might look at the Constitution and say, what is really the intent of this law? But Locke's not the Bible, he's not the Constitution, and yet we really still care about what his intent was. And I wondered why. And I think you just said it, which is that people use Locke to justify beliefs today.
Yeah. But Locke also was very influential in the early American Republic.
Yes. In fact, he wrote the line, I think, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is the way it was phrased.
Yeah. We can already see by the 18th century, by the way, the pursuit of happiness. There's a loosening up here of the strictures, right? By the 18th century, people aren't killjoys anymore, even if they're advocates of the work ethic.
I've also heard it stated that a part of the reason they replaced that word property was so that they didn't grandfather in slavery.
Yeah, that could very well be.
But I like what they replaced it with. Thumbs up on that.
Yep.
Much more fun. Okay, so there's 2 big ideas in here. 3. What justifies ownership for Locke?
Laboring on the land, right? It's work. If you've worked to improve the land and grow stuff on it, then you own it. That's the rule before states set up laws. It's the rule in the state of nature, which is just a state of anarchy. So he's imagining human beings before states even have arisen. They're already farming. And it's the fact that they're actually making that part of the earth useful by growing food that helps other people. And so that what entitles you to own the land. And keep in mind that that Lockean doctrine was enacted in the United States with the Homestead Act, right? Lincoln has a Homestead Act. He says, go out west. You can lay out a plot of land. And as long as you work it for 5 years growing stuff, at that point you own it. It's a very Lockean law that Lincoln had, and it appealed to millions of people who understood the deep connection between working for something and being entitled to own it.
I have to admit, it's very appealing, this idea that you own the land by mixing your labor with it.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like you're tilling your labor into the land.
Correct.
And that's what makes it yours.
Well, it's the fact that you are doing something useful with the land. This is a sharp contrast with, say, Robert Nozick, who's the great libertarian interpreter of Locke, who thought that there was something a little mystical where mixing your labor with something was completely detached from doing any good for other people. And, he asked the question, well, how far can we drive this? If you made some tomato juice and then you dumped it into the ocean, you just mixed your labor with the ocean. Does that mean that now you claim the ocean? He's pushing the limits of this logic, but in fact, he misunderstands Locke's logic. Because Locke would say, well, you just wasted your tomato juice by tossing it in the ocean. You haven't done anybody any good. The real core thing about work, your labor. The only thing that counts as real work is stuff that helps other people, that protects and promotes human life. You do that, then you can claim property. But you can't just do something idle with that property. You can't play croquet on that property, even if you could count that as work, right?
Right. And very aligned with Baxter, which is it's not speculation is not work.
Correct. Baxter would look at contemporary real estate moguls who are flipping houses on pure speculation without even improving the houses, right? And they'd say, no, that's not work.
I like that. House flippers, you were going to hell. You were going to burn in hell.
On the other hand, if before you flip the house, you actually improve it, then you've mixed your labor, you've done something useful. So then that's okay.
Okay. That's good. Financial industry, however, be very, very careful. You might be going to hell.
Correct. Yes.
So what is the spoilage proviso?
Yes. So Locke says you can't let anything go to waste. Before the introduction of money, you really can't acquire more land than you can farm personally, or maybe with your family, right? And before money, then, basically everybody has the same amount of land because there's not that much more that one person could till than another person. You'd have rough equality of holdings. With the introduction of money, though, you can acquire more land, and we're imagining here large extended families could then expand and acquire great estates that way, because then they could sell that food. They might grow much more food than they could consume, but that's okay, because with money, they can sell it on the market, and then they could pile up coins, gold, maybe, which doesn't spoil. So you haven't let anything go to waste. And that's his justification for unequal property holdings.
Got it. Got it. As long as you're not wasting anything, you're okay. And so you can amass larger ownership of land than you would be able to work on your own. What is the sufficiency proviso?
It's a second constraint on how much we are entitled to acquire in the state of nature before states arise. And that is that you have to leave enough that is good for others to appropriate through their own labor. You have to leave enough that is good land to appropriate. Now, some interpreters think, well, you don't really have to leave enough of this good land. You just have to leave enough of this good opportunities to make a living. And those opportunities could include, instead of being a yeoman farmer, you could be a farmhand, a hired hand on the farm, and be paid a wage. And that would be enough and is good, because you can still make a living that way. Now, actually, we know that Locke, he was a political actor as well as a political theorist and pamphleteer. And under William and Mary, just sort of step back a little bit, in 1688, you have the Glorious Revolution, which removes the king and replaces the king with William and Mary, who were brought over from the Netherlands to rule England. It was glorious because it was fairly bloodless. There was a little bit of bloodshed, but it wasn't that big a deal. And King William appoints Locke to run the Board of Trade, which is essentially ruling the colony of Virginia. And under the previous king, Charles II, that king had established a law that's called head rights. So you'd have great landowners in Virginia with these huge plantations. And every servant or slave they brought over, the landowner would be awarded 50 acres. So you could see that this is just an enormous incentive to grow gigantic estates with huge holdings. Locke was totally opposed to this, right? For one thing, it actually introduced a lot more slaves. It created a huge incentive to import slaves from Africa just to expand land holdings. And Locke thought, no. This land here should be available to ordinary poor people in England. So he actually proposed to abolish the head rights system and just give 50 acres to anybody, any free worker in England who wanted to go to Virginia. They would be awarded 50 acres. But he complained that so much land had been appropriated by the large landholders in Virginia that there was not enough in his good land for other people to appropriate. So he also established a set of rules that eventually would break up the big estates and split them up into small parcels that a single family farm could farm. So we can see here that Locke really meant seriously, you need to leave enough as good land for others, not just opportunities to make a living. Although in the last resort, you might need that, but it's not the optimal thing.
And strikes me as this is a concrete example of support for the redistribution of wealth.
Correct.
It's a concrete example of saying we need to redistribute wealth such that there is sufficient distribution of wealth that nobody is poverty-stricken.
Yes, that is the idea. Because we have a fundamental duty to each other to make sure that everybody doesn't just survive, but flourishes, has a decent life.
Now, we're going to go into the difference between the libertarian reading of Locke and then the work ethic reading of Locke. And I'm going to say some of the things the way that Locke is read as libertarian. So, 1, the role of the state should be limited to adjudicating disputes over violation of natural rights to negative liberty is one of them. I don't really understand negative liberty. What is that phrase?
Negative liberty is the idea that I get to do whatever I want as long as I'm not interfering with you or harming you. And so libertarians like that idea, right? I can do whatever I want with my property as long as I'm not being violent to you or maybe defrauding you or something like that.
And so the role of the state is to adjudicate disputes over violations of natural rights to negative liberty and to adjudicate disputes over property. It's responsible for the collective defense. And importantly, individuals only give up rights to liberties as is necessary to support that minimal state. And what really is wild, propertyless people had no voice. In other words, the idea that if you don't have property, you don't get a voice. Do I have that right?
Well, that's the libertarian reading.
That's the libertarian view.
But it's just completely wrong.
Why? Why is it wrong?
Locke imagines that in the state of nature, he does justify, of course, unequal holdings in the state of nature after the introduction of money. That's quite clear. Why have a state then at all? Why can't people just live in a state of anarchy? And his explanation of this is that as people get more prosperous and populous, they're reproducing, they're having more kids, that all the land does end up getting appropriated. And that means that the boundaries of different people's properties start abutting each other. And that's the source of conflict, right? You have two properties next to each other, okay? I dig an irrigation ditch, but now that sends water flowing onto my neighbor's property that might be, say, lower lying. But then if their property is flooded, they can't grow as many crops. And so then they're going to have a dispute with me, like I've done something that hurts them. And we have to adjudicate these things, right? And so conflicts over the use of my land that might interfere with another person's use of their land, you're going to need rules and regulations. And that's really all those disputes, right? You need a neutral judge. And that's why we agree for the protection of our property to set up a state. The state then enters the picture in order to determine land use regulation. Now, this is important. Before my property abuts your property, I can dig as many ditches I want and I can't hurt you because there's a gap between my property and you, right? It's only when things get crowded enough that my use of my property interferes with your use of your property that we now need a whole new set of regulations that very much interfere with my negative liberty. And Locke is very explicit about this. With population growth, and of course in cities, there's even more land use conflicts. Suppose I erect a tall building that casts a shadow over your house in an urban context. Suppose that, say, blocks out your solar panels. Okay, well, who has the right here? Do I have the right to build as high as I want, or have you grandfathered in your right to unimpeded access to sunlight so that you can power your house? Well, thinking just in terms of natural rights is not going to settle that issue. It's a public policy issue. And you need the state to determine who's right in that context. And Locke is absolutely explicit that the natural liberties that we enjoy, the negative liberties we enjoy in the state of nature, don't apply anymore once we set up a state, because now we're crowded and a lot more interfering activities. And then you need like comprehensive land use regulations that weren't needed in the state of nature. And that's what we get. We decide that you can't have a tannery in the middle of a neighborhood because it sends noxious smells and pollution that could hurt the people around. So you have to set up your tannery in some remote spot that isn't going to hurt homeowners and residents and neighborhoods. There's tons of regulations of that nature. And Locke is explicit that when we set up a state, we do have to accept that the state's going to pass laws that will constrain our negative liberties far more than what we had in the state of nature. But we have to, for the sake of promoting human survival and flourishing. We just can't have toxic polluters dumping waste that then poisons our wells.
And he expressed it as essentially it's a universal affirmative duty to protect and support other human beings.
Exactly. So another consequence of the fact that all the land is appropriated in England, you end up having poor people because not everybody has a plot to farm. Well, what are we going to do about that? Well, we have a duty to ensure that everybody can survive and has the material means to survive. And he's quite explicit. That means that the poor law is justified. So England already had a national poor law. It was the first country in Europe to accept that provision for the poor was a duty of the state. Before then, it was the church that was in charge. But Henry VIII had confiscated all the monasteries and the property of the Catholic Church. And so the church wasn't rich enough to provide for the poor anymore. And so they passed a poor law, making it a national responsibility. Now, that responsibility was devolved onto local districts. So it's not like you had a centralized state administering the welfare state. Every parish had its own provision to take care of the destitute. But there was an obligation, and they assessed land taxes, taxes on the tenants of the land who had to pay up in order to provide for the poor.
And where did Locke sit on the idea of, with Baxter, if you were idle rich or idle poor, it was both were vice. Where did Locke sit on that?
The important thing about Locke is that he's writing after England had conducted a census of the poor. They wanted a sense of, well, how many poor people are there? And what's interesting is in the Puritan imaginary, they just assumed everybody was either a deserving poor person, which meant that they were unable to work. Maybe they're like an infant or disabled in some way, like not able-bodied. Or that's a deserving poor. Or you would have the undeserving poor, which are able-bodied people who, for some reason or other, are not working. And those people, maybe they're begging on the streets. And they were condemned by the Puritans because, hey, you should be like doing honest work and not just begging. But in the course of conducting the census of poor people, poor households, they were shocked to discover that there was a third category of poor person. And this was the involuntarily unemployed. So these are able-bodied people who desperately wanted a job, right? So they don't own any property or they don't have a lease or anything. They're desperate for employment. And the Puritans tried then, they thought through the logic of this, and Locke is thinking through the logic of this too, and they realized, well, the best thing to do for people like that is to give them a job. Give them something useful to do. They were shocked. They didn't imagine that this was even a category of person. So Locke, in his essay on the poor law, says that if you encounter an able-bodied person who says they can't find work, what you should do is you should go out to the wealthier people in the parish and force them to offer those people a job, a paying job. This was tried all over during the 17th century. And sometimes what they would do is they would take, say, a widow who maybe wasn't able enough to farm any land, but she's in a cottage. And so they would supply her with some wool and she could then weave that into cloth or something like that. But it turned out that that system of make work wasn't really successful, economically speaking. It wasn't enough to actually enable people to support themselves. And so you find this is the beginnings of, in poor law thinking, there's a constant circulation of policies because there's always this suspicion that people who could work but complain that they couldn't find jobs, maybe there's something wrong with them. Maybe they're lazy or lying or grifting. And so there's always a temptation to be coercive towards those people. And you see this in Locke's essay on the poor law. If they're absolutely unable to work, then you can give them cash relief because we have a duty to make sure that nobody dies or starves to death. But if they are able, the next resort is you force some rich person to hire them so they have a job. But you can hire them out for a lower wage because maybe they're dishonest or grifting. Maybe they're not a very good worker. Else they would have been able to find a paying job already. But then what do you do for people who seem like less capable than that? And you can't find a rich person to hire them. Well, then there's the workhouse, right? You set up a house for the destitute and you force them to labor, including their children. So Locke thought at a ridiculously early age, like 4 or 5, you could already set the kids to work because otherwise they worried that the example of the idleness of their parents would make them lazy. So the parents were corrupting influence. So you had to force even the littlest kids at the earliest age to start laboring so that they would learn virtue that way.
See how it's all mixed up with virtue?
Yeah.
I remember my father once. There was a guy who won the Nobel Prize for doing something in biology that was quite remarkable, but then he stopped biology and he went and hung out on the beach and was just profligate. And I remember my father saying, "What a loser."
Yeah.
I said, "I don't know, Dad." I said, "I'm not sure who's the loser here." But it's this idea that if you're not working, you are vice-ridden.
Oh, yeah. And that's still present in American society.
And Locke was against the idle rich, and he was against slavery. And so he didn't care where idleness lay. But I thought he had a very interesting point about slavery, which is that God owns man. Men can't own men.
Although he does have an exception to that. This exception actually is even written into the 13th Amendment of the United States, the abolition of slavery. There's an exception for criminals, convicted criminals. Now, Locke's exception is actually even narrower than the 13th Amendment exception to involuntary servitude. And that is that if you have engaged in a capital crime that is something that could warrant the death penalty, then of course you could be subject to the death penalty, but that could be commuted to a sentence of slavery. And so anyone involved, say, in an unjust war, right, they're on the wrong side of the war, they're a captive in war, they could be put into slavery. And that was the fundamental justification, actually, for the slave trade, is that we bought these slaves who were captives in war. And so it's okay. But the difference is, Locke is quite explicit about this. You can only enslave the actual criminal. You can't turn that into intergenerational slavery. You can't enslave the criminal's wife, who presumably was not a soldier. You can't enslave the kids. So it's impossible to justify intergenerational slavery on Locke's theory. His exception only permits the enslavement of people who've committed crimes warranting the death penalty. And so slavery as it existed in America or the New World would be absolutely prohibited by Locke's doctrine. And that's why he wanted there to be no more importation of slaves into Virginia. Now, the knock against Locke, of course, is that he was a personal lawyer to Lord Shaftesbury, who was in with the king for a while. This was King Charles II, before William and Mary, before the Glorious Revolution. And Charles was very interested in establishing a constitution that would officially legalize slavery in the Carolina colony. And so it was a closely held corporation, this colony, with all the slavery in it. And Charles commissioned Locke to be the lawyer who drafted the Constitution of the Carolina colony, which provided for slavery. It was a practically medieval constitution. But it's wrong to think that Locke had any power over the terms. He was just a lawyer in this case, acting as a lawyer. And if you're a lawyer for a rich person who wants to draft a will, like you're not entitled to just insert your own ideas about how these people should designate their heirs and say, well, I really think half your wealth should go to charity. Just because you're the lawyer, you're not allowed to like draft that into somebody's will unless they ask for it. You just have to follow the instructions. So Locke is often blamed for supporting slavery in the colony of Carolinas, which of course was intergenerational slavery. But no, he was just drafting the Constitution according to the king's orders. But then he was compensated with shares in the company that owned the Carolina colony. But the only reason why he got shares in the company and in the slave trading company that was sending slaves over to Carolina was that the king had no cash. And so he could only compensate Locke for his lawyer work with shares. And the moment Shaftesbury and Locke decided they were going to break with the king, they basically sold the shares back for the same amount that they got it in the original. So in fact, Locke didn't really personally profit from slavery. He didn't believe in it, but he was complicit. Unquestionably, he was complicit. But that's one of the costs of being a dependent on Lord Shaftesbury, right? You don't have complete freedom of action in those cases. Locke was really dependent on Shaftesbury, and he broke with the king at the same time that Shaftesbury did. Ended up escaping to the Netherlands for a while, keeping his head down after he turned against the king.
I was thinking, I hope I'm never judged on what I'm invested in. I have no idea what I'm invested in.
We're all complicit. You have a 401k, you are complicit in a lot of bad deeds. There's no way around it.
Yeah, right. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.